Phil Anselmo was a name that made the whole metal world stop and listen. He was a monster on stage. A sign of primordial wrath, a shadow screaming through smoke and lights, and his voice was no longer just sound, it was a weapon that cut through every barrier. They called Phil Anselmo the essence of Pantera, the roar of 90s metal, and a fierce pulse of life flowing through a dismal world. But beneath the fiery shows and records that sold millions of copies, there was a broken soul. A man in the spotlight, writhing in pain and alone with narcotics. A man whose heart stopped because he used too much drugs and was kicked out by his closest brothers and condemned by the world for things he could never take back. For a long time, he lived as if there was no tomorrow or he didn't want one anymore. Phil Anselmo was never a perfect legend. He wasn't afraid of the dark. He let it take over him at times. That's why his tale is so important to convey. A tale of breaking, falling, finding redemption, and staying alive. Survival is a scream that still rings, even after the world has moved on. So, who is Phil Anselmo, really? Is he the voice of a rebellious generation or the victim of the fire he started? Is he a living legend or a spirit in exile still looking for a way home? Life in the beginning. Philip Hansen. Anselmo was born on June 30, 1968, in New Orleans, Louisiana, a city full of character, jazz music, openness, and turmoil. Philip Anselmo, Sr., an Italian-American who owned a classic Italian restaurant with live music, was his father. His mother, on the other hand, kept behind the scenes and dealt with problems that weren't spoken about. The Anselmo family wasn't broke. But there was never enough love in the house. Phil has two more siblings and saw his parents' marriage fall apart when he was quite young. He didn't have a close relationship with his father, it was more formal. Phil grew up among music and the colorful atmosphere of his father's restaurant, but he never thought of it as his stage. He often felt like an outsider, like someone standing outside of every frame. Phil was a skinny boy with a lot of energy, and he acted out and did things without thinking from a young age. He went to public elementary schools in New Orleans, where he was always getting in trouble and moving about because of his bad behavior and short temper. His grades weren't great, but no one could deny that he had a strange imagination and good observational skills. These attributes would eventually inspire his intense and surprisingly deep music. Phil's boyhood wasn't filled with sports fields or painting studios. Instead, it was filled with noise. The loud music from Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, and Iron Maiden recordings booming from his bedroom created a distinct universe where he could escape the commotion outside. Phil didn't get into music as a hobby. It was a lifeline. He once claimed, "I didn't turn to metal for fun. I resorted to it because I needed something to yell for me." Phil took up a guitar for the first time when he was 14, but it was his voice that really defined who he was. He started yelling without any formal training or complicated method, trying out different ways to say the words, different tones, and the rage that was building inside him. At this time, he joined local bands like Samhain, not to be confused with Glenn Danzig's band of the same name, and Razor White. He instantly became the center of attention because of how wild he was on stage and how raw his energy was. "I always felt like an outsider in a city full with jazz and funk." He was different from the other youngsters. He never thought about being a doctor, an engineer, or a football player. He wanted to stand on stage with a mic and shout until the anguish went away. Phil never wanted to be famous. It was already hard just to be alive. Then, as his teenage years flew by in a whirl of screams and late-night club gigs, he got a call from Arlington, Texas. A band that has put out 3 albums but is still looking for the proper singer. A band that wants to be heavier, more real, and more deadly, but is stuck between glam and punk. Phil Anselmo was the name they gave. First job. Phil Anselmo got an invitation to join Pantera, a Texas-based band, when he was only 18 years old. At the time, the band was still trying to find a balance between the flashing lights of glam metal and the desire to be taken seriously in the underground scene. They had put out 3 albums on their own and gained a little following, but they were missing the most important thing, a sense of who they were. Everything changed when Phil walked into the studio to audition. Didn't bring the light of a star, just a raw, wild force that was violent and primitive. Dimebag Darrell, the band's guitar genius, knew right away that this was the last piece. A voice that isn't meant to make people happy, but to make them think. Phil wasn't just a singer, he was a living proclamation, a howl from deep within that no one could learn or copy. Power Metal was the first album Phil made with Pantera. 1988 was a transitional year for the band. They still held on to some of their past, but they started to go in a very different direction. Power Metal was the first step in getting rid of their shiny shell, making their sound rougher, and going into area where not many people would dare to go. Phil's entrance also changed the band's look and attitude completely. He cut off his long, glam hair, put on black t-shirts and cargo pants, had tattoos all over his body, and performed with eyes that seemed like they could eat the crowd. He wasn't just singing on stage. He yelled, made threats, and broke down the wall between him and the throng. Instead of being scared, the crowd yelled back. Meanwhile, the members of Pantera could tell that the music was changing. Glam was at its best and was starting to go down. People wanted something more real. More weighty and rough. Pantera changed who they were at that time, not because they wanted to sell more records, but because they felt like it. Pantera signed with the big label Atco Records in 1989. It wasn't just a business arrangement, it was a chance to start anew and finally get out of their own way. In 1990, Cowboys from Hell was out. It was the first album that really showed that Pantera was a new power in heavy metal. At the time it came out, Cowboys from Hell was just the beginning. It was a statement that Pantera was ready to burn the past and go on a one-way trip with Phil Anselmo as its furious, unforgiving soul. Later, it would be regarded as a breakthrough record of the decade. What happened next, from the boom in business to the demise of the company, would be a whole other story. But for Phil alone, the path from being a wild, unruly youngster in New Orleans to being the voice of a new wave of metal was proof enough. He didn't merely join the band Pantera. He gave it new life. A big step forward in your career. Pantera didn't just put out a new album when Cowboys from Hell came out in 1990. They changed the heavy metal map. The record had a new kind of energy in every part, from Dimebag Darrell's razor-sharp riffs to Vinnie Paul's suffocatingly tight drumming to Phil Anselmo's haunting guttural screams. It was metal that didn't just rely on speed anymore, it relied on planned violence. People nicknamed it groove metal. But for those who were there, it was just the sound of truth, raw, black, and unpolished. At the time, Phil's voice was unlike anyone else's. He didn't strive to impress listeners with perfect singing or shock them with quirkiness. He screamed from the gut with a wild energy, as if every word were a punch to the chest of the person listening. He wasn't just a performer on stage, he was a survivor, a wounded warrior bringing his scars into the lights and shouting into them until they stopped. Cowboys from Hell didn't become popular right away, but it spread like wildfire underground. Pantera became the future in the metal community, and Phil was seen as a symbol of pure, unfiltered honesty in both his emotions and his way of life. No acting, no pretending, and no polishing. He was just who he was. Fierce. Uncooked. Not sorry. In 1992, Pantera went back to the studio after almost 2 years of non-stop touring. This time, they didn't just want to follow up, they wanted to start a war. The result was Vulgar Display of Power, which is one of the most important heavy metal albums of all time. From the nerve-wracking riff of Mouth for War to the suppressed, angry scream of This Love to the timeless song Walk with its unyielding message, it was a manifesto for a generation that had lost faith in authority and religion, community, and even family. Phil didn't use metaphors in his lyrics. It sounded like he was peeling his own skin off while he wrote. And that's what made millions of young people feel like they were being heard. After the creative success of Obscene Display of Power, Pantera was the main act at every major metal festival. But their real apex came in 1994, when they put out Far Beyond Driven. An album that was so nasty and dark that it didn't make sense. But it went straight to number 1. One on the Billboard 200, beating out pop, grunge, and other alternative bands. In the history of metal, it was an unprecedented achievement. But they had to pay for that triumph. Phil was coming apart as the band became better. Years of touring without a break, back ailments that weren't treated, and emotional traumas that weren't healed pushed him to the edge. He started taking huge doses of medicines to dull the discomfort. He went to heroin when those didn't work. No one knew at first. Still yelled like a wild animal on stage and still led the crowd like a crazy preacher. But what happened behind the scenes was different. He started to miss interviews, cut himself apart from the band, and became increasingly remote and unidentifiable. Phil's relationship with the Abbott brothers, Dimebag Darrell and Vinnie Paul, began to break down. They still played together and smiled for the cameras, but they stopped writing songs. The chats over beer late at night came to an end. After a gig in Dallas on July 13, 1996, things got too much. Phil Anselmo, who had just gotten off stage, overdosed on heroin and had a heart attack that lasted over 5 minutes. The band believed they had lost him for good. But for some reason, Phil lived. The media was astonished by the event, and fans were scared. But it wasn't a wake-up call for Phil. Just another step in a slow-motion path to self-destruction. Pantera put out the Great Southern Trendkill the same year. It was their darkest, angriest, and most personal record. Phil's vocals were mostly recorded separately in New Orleans, which is far from where the rest of the band was recording in Texas. It was an obvious clue that things were falling apart inside. Pantera was still a band on paper, but they were no longer one. Phil opened out about the darkest parts of his mind on songs like Suicide Note Part 1 and 2 and Floods. The words weren't weapons against the world anymore. They were like mirrors reflecting the maelstrom inside him that was tearing him apart. People who paid attention might feel it. This wasn't merely a musical piece. It was a call for help. After that, there was a long stillness. For a few years, Pantera almost stopped doing anything. Phil put a lot of time and energy into side projects like Down and Superjoint Ritual, which brought out an even darker, more brooding, and threatening aspect of his music. In the meantime, it was impossible to overlook the distance between him and Dimebag Darrell. Their fraternity turned into distrust, and ultimately into sullen anger. Pantera broke up for good in 2003. No words, no big news conference, just a silent slash that hurt like a wound that would never heal. People now thought that Phil Anselmo, the man who had gave Pantera its soul, was the one who had killed it. After Pantera broke up unofficially in 2003, Phil Anselmo didn't say goodbye, hold a press conference, or give any explanations. He just vanished. But that silence didn't last long. It was a time to go inside and also the start of a new trip. One where music was no longer a cry of wrath against the world, but a confession, a wound that wouldn't heal, and a sentence he gave himself. Fans were still sad over Pantera's death when Phil was quietly establishing another empire. It was harsher, more extreme, and more personal. He went back to Down, the band he started in the mid-1990s with pals from New Orleans like Pepper Keenan, Corrosion of Conformity, and Jimmy Bauer, I Hate God. NOLA, their first album, came out in 1995 and was already a cult masterpiece. But it wasn't until after Pantera that Down really became the place where Phil unloaded all the damaged parts of himself into music. Down was not like Pantera at all. It didn't catch fire or burn. It crawled slowly, with a heavy, sad, and dark feeling. It was southern sludge metal, where sadness didn't shout but groaned, and anger didn't explode but smoldered like fire in your hand. Phil started conveying the tale of his life through music, not interviews or memoirs, with albums like Down 2, A Bustle in Your Hedgerow, 2002, and Down 3, Over the Under, 2007. Each riff, beat, and lengthy exhale was a part of the songs. Phil also started another band called Superjoint Ritual, which was rougher, wilder, and more chaotic than anything else he had done previously. This wasn't a band that played live. It was a cleanup. Phil yelled about addiction, sleepless nights with no way out, and times when his heart stopped and he didn't know whether he would wake up again in Superjoint. It was hard to listen to Superjoint's music. It was like pouring acid on a wound, but for those who understood, it was the most honest thing ever. He didn't stop there, though. Phil started Philip H. Anselmo and the Illegals, a solo band where he wrote all the songs, produced them, and sent out all the messages. Phil plunged deeper into his turbulent inner world than ever before with songs like Walk Through Exits Only, 2013, and Choosing Mental Illness as a Virtue, 2018. The shouts weren't simply for show, They were the cries of a man fighting with himself, wondering, do I still deserve to be heard? But maybe Phil's most important and modest contribution after Pantera was starting Housecore Records. Through this label, he not only published his own music but also supported scores of underground artists in the sludge, doom, and death metal genres. He didn't see this as an investment, he saw it as a duty. If I've made it through everything, he once commented, then I have a responsibility to open the door for others still screaming in the dark. Though long removed from commercial spotlight, Phil continues to tour, no longer in stadiums of tens of thousands, but in smaller venues where the crowd is close enough to see the wrinkles on his forehead. He doesn't try to recreate Pantera. He doesn't relive the screams of youth. What he brings to the stage now is rawness, a man knocked down by life standing not to triumph, but simply to prove he's still alive. With every project, every song, Phil seems to be writing his own will. A legacy that doesn't sparkle, isn't easily digestible, but lingers hauntingly. He once said, I know I've hurt a lot of people. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want that. When someone listens to my music, they understand that I tried. For some, that's not enough. For others, it's the only thing that matters. Personal life. When the stage lights dimmed and the final drumbeat faded, Phil Anselmo returned to a completely different world. No audience, no screaming, just a cold room, a body wrecked by pain, and a mind shattered by memories no one but him could truly understand. If the stage was where Phil fought with screams, then his personal life was a silent battlefield. One where he lost over and over again. Since the mid-1990s, Phil had been living with excruciating back pain caused by spinal injuries, the result of overperforming, falling off stage, and years of relentless physical strain. Doctors had advised him to rest completely, but instead, Phil chose to swallow handfuls of opioids, then turned to hard liquor, and finally, heroin. A drug that, as he once put it, temporarily killed the pain without having to think about tomorrow. For years, he lived a routine of self-poisoning, then stepped on stage like nothing had happened until his body could no longer take it. But drugs weren't the only thing eating away at Phil. Fame, adoration, and the image of being untouchable had turned him into a shell. Inside was a man who no longer knew how to love anyone, including himself. His personal life became closed off and cold. He was once married to Stephanie Opal Weinstein, a blues musician and longtime friend with whom he founded the project Southern Isolation, a band with a gloomy, lethargic tone that mirrored Phil's mood at the time. But the marriage didn't last. Phil was still too consumed by addiction, the stage, and his personal demons. He let love slip away as if it were inevitable. Phil has no children. When asked about it, he didn't dodge the question. On the contrary, he answered with brutal honesty. I didn't want to bring a life into this world when I couldn't even control my own. I used to think I didn't deserve to be a father, and I still think that. Loneliness became the default state of Phil Anselmo's life in the years after Pantera. In the early 2000s, he lived reclusively in a house on the outskirts of New Orleans. Away from crowds, rarely seen in public outside of music projects. The death of Dimebag Darrell in 2004, who had once been a friend, bandmate, and brother on stage, felt like a knife driven straight into his heart. Though they hadn't been close for years, Phil never imagined their story would end with a cold-blooded onstage murder. After Dimebag's death, Phil became one of the most divisive figures in the metal community. Many blamed him for previous angry comments where he had said someone should give Dime a lesson, a statement he insisted was impulsive and never meant with malice. He apologized publicly, he wept on live television, he reached out to the Abbott family with deep remorse, but the apology was never accepted. Vinnie Paul, Dime's brother, cut off all contact with Phil until his own death in 2018. For many years, Phil lived like an exile from the very community he once ruled. But it was also during this time that he began quietly trying to rebuild, not with headlines or media campaigns, but with small actions. He started getting clean, he began eating healthier, he adopted pets, tended a garden, and with his longtime partner Kate Richardson, a music manager and one of the few constant companions in his life, began piecing together what was left of his life. Kate didn't just help Phil find balance, she became the only person who made him believe he still deserved to live. Phil Anselmo's name is still often followed by controversy. The 2016 incident, when he raised a Nazi salute and shouted white power on stage at a festival, reignited public outrage. Once again, Phil bowed his head and apologized, calling it a stupid, drunken, indefensible act. And once again, his fans were left to wonder, has Phil really changed? The answer, perhaps, doesn't lie in his statements, but in the quiet things he's done since, the small-scale tours, the speeches about mental health, the rare moments of reflection on his past, and the apology to Dimebag he never stopped carrying with him. Phil Anselmo. A man who once reached the heights through screams, has spent most of his life in silence. And yet, it is in that silence that we see him most clearly. Alone, weary, but never fully defeated. Present life. Nearly 3 decades after the fiery days of Pantera, Phil Anselmo is still here. Not as a living legend, but as a weathered ghost, still learning how to exist amid the wreckage of what was once destroyed. He no longer seeks the spotlight, doesn't chase trends, and certainly doesn't cling to old glories. Yet, in the quiet of New Orleans, still lives, still writes music, still screams, but in a wholly different way. In 2024, just when many believed Phil had fully retreated into the shadows, he unexpectedly resurfaced with Scour, an extreme metal band with a ferocious lineup. That entire year, they performed only one show at Southport Hall in Louisiana, like a secret ritual with almost no promotion, no fanfare, no spectacle. But for those present, it was like a prayer made of sound, dark, intense, and brutally honest. That same year, Phil maintained one of his odd yet signature traditions, building a haunted house for Halloween open to local residents. In behind-the-scenes footage, he's seen wearing a hard hat, carrying wooden planks, stringing up ropes. No longer a proud metal icon, but a middle-aged man quietly finding joy in small things. Phil once said, "Demons aren't nearly as scary as what people have done to each other. But if I can make someone laugh or scream, that's a kind of salvation, too." In 2025, Phil surprised fans again when Scour released their debut full-length album Gold on February 21, featuring Gary Holt, Slayer, Exodus on the track Coin. The album is a declaration, heavy, feral, but also deeply introspective. Gold isn't just sonic violence. It plays like a shredded diary, capturing the final chapters of someone who once stood in the eye of the storm. Most notably, Phil officially reunited Pantera in a way no one had seen before. Alongside original bassist Rex Brown, with Zakk Wylde replacing Dimebag Darrell and Charlie Bonanti replacing Vinnie Paul, they launched a summer tour across the U.S. beginning in July 2025. Many called it a Pantera tribute, but to Phil, it was a public act of repentance. A chance to say goodbye to the past, not with tears, but with riffs and the last screams he had left. Not everyone approved. Thousands of voices still criticize. Some still refuse to forgive. But at each show, when the spotlight falls on Phil's aging face, gray hair, and deep-set eyes, people no longer see someone trying to conquer. They see a soul. Trying to sing what was never said to the brother he lost. Outside of music, Phil's daily life has become strangely simple. He still lives with longtime partner Kate Richardson, his music manager and the quiet companion of his later years. No children, no scandals, no loud declarations, just pets, plants, the underground bands he mentors through Housecore Records, and a home where music still echoes from the downstairs room every night. Phil Anselmo no longer screams out of rage. He sings like a prayer. For the souls lost, the mistakes that can't be undone, and for himself, the last man standing from a band that once screamed for an entire generation. Phil Anselmo is not a hero. He never tried to be a role model. He made mistakes, serious ones, sometimes inexcusable. He's hurt others, destroyed himself, pushed himself to the very edge of darkness. But one thing has never changed. He never ran from any of it. From the blazing stages with Pantera to small shows for a few hundred people, from drug overdoses that stopped his heart to silent public apologies, from a man who screamed in rage to someone who now sings as if pleading for forgiveness, Phil Anselmo's journey has never been one of invincibility. It is the story of a complex soul trying to rebuild from the ashes he set himself. Today, when Dimebag's guitar lives on only through loudspeakers, when Vinnie Paul has returned to the earth and Pantera remains a quiet monument in the memory of millions, Phil Anselmo is still here, singing with a voice that's tired but heartbreakingly honest. He no longer sings for glory. He sings to preserve the truth, and sometimes that alone is a victory. What do you think about Phil Anselmo's bitter yet profound journey? To you, is he a living legend? A fallen man who found the strength to rise again? Or simply a human being carrying too many scars to ever forget? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story stirred something in you, anger, sorrow, or empathy, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, so we can continue exploring the lives of rock and roll souls who once shook an entire generation.